Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate some of the basics of cloth simulations. So in this little video I created a number of different effects on cloth. So you can see we've got a cloth being pulled around some obstacles here. You can see we've got some curtains in the background that are moving, and in fact they start to move much more at one point and then fall back again. So that shows you the effect of wind forces on the cloth. And I'll talk through the basic settings of a cloth simulation. So to begin with, we need to set up a scene. So I'm just going to add a plane, and that's going to be our ground. So we'll give that a basic material so we can differentiate it. And we'll make that a sort of greeny yellow color, and we'll call that ground. I'm now going to add another plane, and we'll just raise that up a bit, and we'll call that cloth. And the first thing we need to do is to subdivide it. So if I just add a cloth simulation, so I've gone to physics here and I just say cloth, and I just press play at the moment, it will just fall straight through the ground plane. But even if I go to the ground now and I set that as a collision object and press play, you'll see the cloth just falls in a completely static way, and it really doesn't have any cloth-like properties to it. I'll put it at an angle now, and we'll let that fall, and you can see it just falls like a piece of cardboard. There's a little bit of bouncing there, but it's not at all cloth-like. And the reason for that is we need more subdivisions. The cloth simulation acts on those subdivisions. So I've gone into edit mode, right click and say subdivide. So we'll just go for 2 lots of subdivision at the moment, so you can see them there. And now I'll press play and let it run again, but still we need that slight angle for us to see anything. So you can see we've got a very stiff cloth now, but you can see how this is beginning to work. So I'll go into edit mode again, right click and say subdivide, and this time I'll add another 10 cuts to those 2 that I'd already done. So that's still not a huge number for a cloth simulation, but more than enough for us to start to see it behaving like cloth. I'll just come up here and turn on cavity, which can make shapes a little easier to see. So you can now see what that's doing. I'm going to just turn this down to 100 frames for the time being. And you can see we've got a little line down here, and that shows that it is baking as we go. But obviously we might want to do rather more than that with our cloth. I'll just give it another material. So what if we just wanted our cloth to hang? So we go into edit mode now, and I'm going to select just these 4 vertices. It could just be one vertex, but I'm going to select those 4 around the central point. I'm going to click here under object properties, and I'm going to add a vertex group, and I'll just click assign. So if I double press A to unselect everything and then click here to say select, that shows that group is now associated with those 4 vertices. So now go back to the physics properties, and if we come down here under shape, we have this option for pinning group. And that symbol means it's associated with groups. So we can click here and we can select the group that we created. We just left it at the default name of group. Now if I press play, you can see it is pinned to that area. And we can now see it's looking quite crude. So let's just increase the subdivisions again. We won't go too mad this time. We need to select everything and then subdivide. And perhaps just 2 more subdivisions. That's quite a few vertices now. And you can see it's taking quite a bit longer, so I'm going to actually undo that. I just wanted to show you that it will look more like material with more subdivisions. But if we want to, because one of the benefits of having fewer subdivisions is the quicker simulation, what we can do is press Ctrl 2, and that's now added a subdivision surface modifier, so we can see in here. But the important thing is that it is after the cloth simulation. If I put it before, then of course the cloth simulation will act on the subdivided surface and we'll get the same issue. And you can also get some slight oddities. But now we're getting the same number of subdivisions as I just created, by subdividing, but they're not actually taking part in the simulation. They're estimating where it would be. So they're sort of simulating the simulation almost. So it gives you a finer result without it actually adding significantly to the simulation time. The other thing we'll want to do is add shade smooth. And then that makes it look much better. It looks like a piece of leather or something now. The next problem we can see is that the material actually passes through itself. Sometimes that's not going to be a problem. So if you have perhaps a pillow or something like that, you're not going to necessarily get occasions where you have what's called self-collisions. But with pieces of cloth like flags and things like that, you're much more likely to have self-collisions, and therefore you don't want it passing through itself. So if we go back to the cloth simulation and we scroll down, we've got an option under collisions, and we can see object collisions are on at the moment, which is what will make it collide with the ground plane, but self collisions are not, because they will add to the simulation time. So let's just turn those on and start again. Now to begin with, you can see it hasn't made any difference. And that's because some changes that you make are not automatically reflected. An easy way to force it is just to change things like the quality steps up here, and I've just changed it back again, but you can see the cache has vanished. So now when I press play, it will resimulate, or it will try to. Somewhere along the line I didn't turn on self collisions there. So you can now see it's not passing through itself. You will still occasionally get bugs. None of these physics simulations are 100% perfect, but it's now behaving a little more naturally. So then we can start to look at how it works with obstacles. So I'm going to turn off the pinning for a moment, just by clicking that. So it will now fall to the ground again. And I'm going to add a cube, make it a little smaller, and we'll have it roughly on the ground, give it some rotation, and we'll switch on collision. So if I now start the simulation, you can see, especially if I turn that off, we've now got a cube wrapped in some cloth. So it's as easy as that to get the basics of a simulation. But obviously that may not be the type of cloth you're wanting. So there are a number of factors that will affect how that behaves as a cloth and what it sort of gives you. So things like the mass, air viscosity, so how much is it affected by air? So we can try turning that down to 0. And you can see it fell a little quicker. But other than that, didn't make much difference. We can try turning it up to maximum, which appears to be 10. It slowed down a bit there. And essentially what the air is doing is braking it. So by that I mean slowing things down because it's having to pass through the air. You will get some effects of air when you're spinning, moving cloth around very quickly. But generally speaking, it's a sort of damping effect. We can play with the mass. So let's put the mass up to something quite large. So let's say 50 kilograms. Fell much faster, but also you can see how the cloth is stretching down. And now if we go to a very light material, we'll make it 0.1 of a kilogram, maybe 0.01 of a kilogram actually. And you can now see the effect of air is having more of an effect on it. We're not even going to reach the end point there, so what I'll do is lower it to closer to the target, and then we'll start the simulation. And you can see it's just like the lightest of tissue paper slowly descending, but also if I stop it, if I'll give it another 50 frames, I'll take it up to 150 frames now. You can also see how the stiffness of the material is making it stick out much more. So it is like a piece of tissue paper. Because it's not so heavy, it's not pulling itself down to the ground. That's all affected by these areas, so you can play around with things like tension and compression, shear and bending. And it has little tooltips on here on what it means, but they're fairly intuitive. And then you have damping for those effects as well. So generally speaking, you're not going to need to play with those too much unless you're trying to create a very special effect. Let me go back to the default setting. So if we raise that up again and let it go, there we go. So that's the default material again. And then we've got an interesting one that's new with, I think it was 2.9 it came in at, which is pressure. So by default, it's not making any difference yet. But let's put this up to 5. And you can see it actually goes flying off. So if I'll put it a little lower than that. So you can see it's almost like there's a wind effect. This is what you'd use to make a pillow because it tries to inflate the cloth. If I do Alt-R there to take away the rotation, and now to start the simulation, you can see it's just floating up a bit, as though it's on a cushion of air. So you could make a whole shape out of that, and it would form a kind of pillow. Well, it would form a pillow, and this is one of the things that a lot of people used it for as soon as it became available. And again, you've got elements that you can play with here. You can specify that it only affects certain parts of the mesh by identifying vertex groups here. We've got internal springs. I've never yet used this, but obviously this is going to add a certain amount of springiness to the cloth that will be defined by this. So if I just put that in there, we've turned that up a little bit, but you can't see an awful lot on there. It's a stretchiness effect. Even at a very high value, it's not looking that different. But rather than going through lots and lots of individual settings, you'll probably find an easy starting point is to go to here. You see this little dots up here, and that's presets. You can create your own, but you can also just select them. So if I select silk, for example, the vertex mass changed slightly and some of the other variables will have changed as well. And now you can see we've got a very easy to bend material that's relatively light and will flow around easily with turbulence and forces, which we'll get into in a minute. Or I can go for something like leather. You can see the values change down there. And you can see it barely wants to bend at all. So we'll go back to silk and down it goes. Quality will affect how well collisions are detected. So sometimes you may find that because something is moving quite fast, it will end up penetrating itself or some other object, and that can cause some instabilities. Sometimes you can fix that by increasing the quality, but bear in mind that will increase the time to do the simulation. And you can change quality up here. It's very unusual to need to really change that. Collision distance relates to the distance between the cloth and the collision object that determines a collision has happened. So you can see it's 0.015 meters here. Sometimes increasing that can help avoid things like penetration of objects that should be colliding, but generally speaking the defaults are pretty good. 0 is more likely to set a problem. You're more likely to have issues and instabilities. And if you do get instabilities, use of clamping can help. So you can turn that up there, and sometimes that will help avoid some instabilities. And again, the same thing for collisions is there for self collisions as well, and again clamping. We also have a field weights option under here, so by default fields are all fully turned on, but you might want something that's affected by perhaps gravity but not affected by the wind force, or vice versa, or you want to adjust the effect of gravity. So you can do that in here. One other thing is the speed multiplier. So if I set this to 5, you can see it all happens very quickly, and you can see now because it was simulating very fast, we actually had a problem with penetration of the model, and it's all jiggling around a lot as well. You tend to get a little bit of jiggle with certain physics simulations anyway. Or of course we can go the other way. So 0.25 would be a quarter of real speed. And clearly the additional effect that you get from adjusting the speed modifier is that Blender spends more frames calculating where the next position for each vertex is going to be. So it will be a more accurate and therefore potentially more stable simulation. You can see that looks somewhat better. And so sometimes if you really are having a lot of problems getting your simulation to work without flying off in strange directions, adjusting the speed modifier to a slower modifier may be the way to fix it, even if you then need to run the resulting animation faster in order to get the speed of the simulation that you want. In other words, to make it so you might run it at quarter speed when you do the simulation, but once it's baked you can then turn the speed of the animation up to 4 times normal speed to get the normal speed that you would want for your animation. So we'll put that back to 1, and then we'll talk a bit about forces. So if I add a force field in, and we'll just make it a simple wind force, and I press play, and at the moment it's not having any effect. Now it does seem like forces generally, especially the wind force, need to be quite a high value to have much of an effect on cloth. So we're in the physics selection and we've got the force field selected. So I'm going to turn the strength up to 100 now. We may just be able to see it starting to affect the cloth, but now we'll go to 1000, and you can see it's now a bit like the inflation force. It is starting to affect the cloth now. But that had to be all the way up to 1000 to affect that. If I turn this perhaps at an angle, you can see it's blowing the cloth off to the side. But still works quite effectively. You can see the collisions are still working and so on. All of the forces will affect cloth. If we tried, for example, a turbulence force, and again that's not affecting it a lot at the moment, and you can see how the cloth sort of lifted up a bit there as it fell down, and that was because of the turbulence force, and you can see it's still being moved by it, and that's now at 5000. So double again, And now you can see it's starting to move it around and spin it around and so on. And we can change it to other forces as well. That's obviously way too high for this particular force. You will need to find the value that works, and clearly the vortex force is quite a strong force. There, even at 50, the vortex force is starting to crumple the material in. So how do you move some material around? So I'm just going to remove that force. We'll go back to the beginning. If I want my material to move around and perhaps drag over that cube, because we've got a pinning group defined, we can use that. Basically moving the cloth around actually just moves the pinning group around. We'll go back to the cloth properties and we'll turn pinning on again. Just to remind ourselves what that's going to look like. And we'll go to the beginning of the simulation and we'll move the cloth over here somewhere. And press I and store the location. We'll come to say frame 70 and we'll move the cloth, and you'll notice it's just the little origin dot that's moving to somewhere about there, perhaps a little higher. Don't worry about it penetrating the ground plane at the moment because it hasn't done the simulation to work out where the rest of the cloth should be yet. So I'm just going to press I and select location. Go back to the beginning and then press play. You can now see the cloth being dragged over this cube and stops there. Simple as that really to move the cloth around. And if you wanted it to follow a path, so we could just add a curve which is a path. We can move that path around a little bit. Don't make the curve too severe because you may have problems with this simulation if you try to whip the cloth around too fast. Now I could just get the cloth to follow that curve, but what I wanted to do when I did the sampler was really just be able to control whether the cloth was affected by the curve path or not. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to add at this point an empty. An empty is a sort of almost as it were a physical object, but it's not renderable. There's no vertices to it. So you use it for doing things like this. I'm then going to add a constraint to that empty, which is to follow path. And I'm going to select my path. They always go shooting off like that, so we need to bring it back to where it should be. And we also need to say animate path. If I press play now, you can see the empty goes racing off along that path. And by default, the path's animated over 100 frames. So I'll select my path, go to curves, we'll go to path animation, and we'll say 150 frames now, because that's the duration of my animation at the moment. And now I'll select my cloth, and on frame 1 I'm going to press Alt I and delete keyframes, then click this little icon which will jump us to that keyframe, Alt I and delete that keyframe. We'll go back to the beginning and it's just left the cloth there, so if I press play now it just does that. And I'm now going to go to constraints on my cloth, add a constraint, and we'll say child of the empty. So you can see we've got a line there now. I'll just move where it starts to somewhere around where the empty is. I'll actually make it a bit lower so we can see the empty. If I press play now, you can see the cloth is just following that empty around as it follows the path, which is great. So you can see that works fine. But the reason I did it this way is because part way through I wanted the cloth to stop following the path. I wanted to be able to control when it started and when it stopped. And what we can do, of course, is animate the influence. So I could start with an influence of 0. By about frame 20, I can put that influence up to 1. I could let it run for perhaps 85 frames. Go back 1 frame, set the keyframe to 1 again by just pressing I while hovering over that. And then I'll go on 1 frame. Just use the arrow keys on the keyboard for that, and set the influence to 0 and press I again. So you can see the keyframes down there. So let's see what that does. And you can see the cloth just suddenly shoots back. Which is why it's not always a good idea to do things very quickly. So if I wanted to just make that smoother, I would just go to the dope sheet, just select that column keyframes, and just move them to the right, perhaps up to frame 100. So now, rather than it being a sudden change of influence, it will be a more gradual one. which gives the cloth simulation time to catch up, as you can see. You can see the empty still going over there and the cloth has come away. So that would be a way for you to control how the cloth moves to some extent, and then have it default back to its original position or some new position, because of course you could still have other animated positions. So now what if we wanted something a bit like a curtain? I know there have been more extensive tutorials on how to create curtains, and I've even done one myself, but just to remind people very quickly, I'm going to add a plane and we'll lift it up there, go into edit mode, GX, and we'll just bring it to about there. So the origin is there, and now I'm going to subdivide it. We'll go for 20 subdivisions, which is a fair number, and then I'm going to select, in fact I'm going to skip 2 and then select a vertex, skip 2 and select a vertex all the way along here like that, and then I'm going to go to object properties and assign a group. We've got every third vertex selected there. It doesn't have to be every third, it could be every other or every fifth or whatever. Wanted to leave enough in there so that we can get the simulation. I'll just do half of the curtains for now. So we'll now go to object properties again, and we'll go to shape keys. And without doing anything yet, we will just click the plus here to get the basis. So this is the starting shape. Then click it again, and this is now key 1, and we'll go into edit mode, and we'll scale on the X. Now if I just do that, they're going to scale in towards the center. So what I want to do is change where we are scaling to. I'm just going to go into orthographic mode to make things a little easier, and I'm going to put the origin just there. I'm just checking its level, and then we'll change how this works, and we'll say to 3D cursor. So I'm now going to scale on the X, and you notice all those vertices at the top are heading back towards the right hand side. I don't want them to be on top of each other, but much closer together, somewhere around there. Looks like a mess at the moment, but don't worry. We'll come out of edit mode now, and we can see if we turn the value of that shape key up, you can see it's essentially pulling those vertices together. So I'm going to go to the beginning of the simulation, and I'm going to keyframe the value for key 1, and then we'll go to say frame 25, and we'll put the value at 1 and keyframe that. So over the course of a second, those vertices are going to draw together. We'll now go to physics properties, and we'll add a cloth simulation. We'll make sure that this is got the default values for, say, cotton. We'll try cotton. Under shape, we'll select group for our pinning group. If this was something moving around, we would need to select dynamic mesh. But because we're distorting the shape itself, we don't tick dynamic mesh. Otherwise you'll get problems. And we need to turn on self collisions, of course. So let's just give that another new material and see what happens. You can see we haven't got a subdivision surface on there at the moment, but you can see it drew together. So we'll say shade smooth, and I'll also add a subdivision surface. And you can see how that drew in. Now if you need to sort of preset how this works, if I just go to the basis, if you need it to wrinkle in a particular way, what you can also do is either add a shape to begin with by offsetting perhaps every other column of vertices, or just do that under the key 1. I'll move them slightly on the y-axis. And this is a relatively low resolution simulation, so I can perhaps add a few more. I'll add a couple of subdivisions there, and you can see this is now selecting groups of vertices, so that may or may not be satisfactory. But once it's settled down, you'll see that that's giving us an approximation of what a curtain might look like. So because it's doing that, what we might want to do is perhaps reduce that a little bit. So I've just pressed Control minus and Control minus again. And now we've just got these individual vertices selected, just removing that group and then adding a new one. And then if we go to the cloth simulation again, because I removed the group, I just need to add it back. So I adjusted my curtain slightly. So I put the quality up slightly. I went with the default 0.3 kilograms for the weight. So let's see what that looks like. And possibly it's a bit too extreme in terms of the movement. So I can reduce that. If I go to this frame and this keyframe here, and we could say 0.75 if I find it's being crumpled too much. Reset the keyframe, and now they won't draw in quite as much. And that gives the material a bit more room to move. And you obviously have to wait for a while if you want your curtains to just hang for them to stabilize. So I've remade the plane there with slightly less subdivisions, and we can see our basic curtain effect there. And I can also demonstrate what happens if you move the subdivision surface above the cloth simulation. So I'm just going to grab that and drop it there. And now if I press play, you can see it's going much more slowly on the simulation. And that's because it's doubled and doubled again. It's quadrupled the number of vertices that it's trying to simulate. And you can see it is going to do it, but it's just not looking as good. You'd need to play around with the stiffness quite a lot. So particularly in cloth simulations, more vertices isn't necessarily a good thing. You need the right number of vertices for the simulation you're trying to create. See, that looks awful. And what that really tells you is, regardless of where you have your subdivision surface, the number of vertices is critical to how the cloth behaves. So don't go mad. Try a level of subdivision. If you need to, increase it a bit, but don't increase it hugely thinking you're going to get a really good quality effect, because you won't always. And not only that, it will also take a lot longer to simulate. And of course, you can affect the curtains with your force field, but as before, it will need to be quite a high value to have much of an effect. Like that. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. There is a Facebook group and a Patreon link in the description below. I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.